At 4:37 in the afternoon on March 8, 1943, a lieutenant colonel with circles under his eyes sat in a conference room on the third floor of a nondescript building at Columbia University in New York. Outside, the city hummed with wartime urgency. Inside, the room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. Maps covered the walls. Tables overflowed with technical reports stamped "confidential" in red ink. The colonel had come from Washington with photographs, grainy, black and white images of bombers, not intact machines, ready for combat, but aircraft that had limped home from missions over occupied Europe. B-17 flying fortresses, each one pocked with holes, hundreds of holes, bullet holes from German machine guns, jagged tears from flak shrapnel, the damage mapped across wings and fuselages like constellations of violence. He spread the photos across the table. 12 images. Each one documented the same grim pattern. Bullet holes clustered on the wingtips, bullet holes riddled the tail section, bullet holes peppered the rear fuselage, almost no bullet holes on the engines, almost none on the cockpit. The colonel tapped one photo with his finger. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice flat with exhaustion, "we're losing aircraft faster than we can replace them. The 8th Air Force flew 60 bomber missions last month. We lost 133 aircraft. That's not sustainable." He looked around the room at the assembled statisticians and mathematicians. Most were civilians. Some were too old for combat. Others had medical deferments. A few were immigrants who'd fled Europe ahead of the Nazi advance. These were the men of the Statistical Research Group, 18 of the brightest mathematical minds in America, brought together by the war to solve problems the military couldn't solve alone. "We need to add armor," the colonel continued, "but armor weighs. Every pound of steel we add to these bombers reduces their range, their speed, their payload. We can't armor everything. We need to be precise." He gestured at the photographs. "So, we analyzed the damage patterns on every bomber that returned from the last 3 months of operations. The data is clear. The wings and tail take the most hits. That's where the armor needs to go." Across the table, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses leaned forward. His name was Abraham Wald, 40 years old, Hungarian by birth. Jewish. He'd escaped Vienna 5 years earlier, days before the Nazis would have sent him to a camp. Now he worked in this windowless room, applying mathematics to warfare. Wald studied the photographs in silence. His colleagues waited. The colonel waited. Everyone in the room knew that Wald's mind worked differently. Where others saw data points, Wald saw assumptions. Where others drew conclusions, Wald questioned the premise. Finally, Wald spoke. His English carried the trace of an accent, precise and careful. "Colonel," he said, "may I ask you a question?" "Of course." "These photographs, these are the aircraft that came back, yes?" "That's correct." "Where are the photographs of the aircraft that did not come back?" The room went still. The colonel blinked. "I'm sorry." "The bombers that were shot down over Germany," Wald said. "The ones that crashed into the Channel. The ones that never made it home. Do we have photographs of those aircraft? Do we know where they were hit?" The colonel's face changed. Understanding arrived slowly, then all at once, like a spotlight snapping on. "No," he said quietly. "We don't. Those planes, they're gone. Behind enemy lines, at the bottom of the ocean." Wald nodded. He pushed the photographs into the center of the table. "Then, Colonel, with respect, I believe you are looking at the wrong data. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." The silence in the room stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then one of the other statisticians, a young economist named Milton Friedman, laughed once, sharp and surprised. "Survivorship bias," Friedman said. "My God, it's survivorship bias." Wald allowed himself the smallest smile. "Precisely." The colonel looked from Wald to Friedman and back again. "Explain it to me," he said. Wald stood and walked to the photographs. He placed his finger on one of the images showing extensive damage to a B-17's wing. "These holes," he said, "they prove that a bomber can be hit in the wing and survive. The aircraft made it back. The crew is alive. The wing, despite being damaged, still functioned well enough to bring them home. He moved his finger to another part of the photograph, an area near the engine, conspicuously clean of damage. "Here," he said, "we see almost no bullet holes, not because the Germans are not shooting at the engines, but because when a bomber is hit in the engine, it does not come home. It goes down, and we never see it again." The colonel stared at the photograph. His hand came up slowly to cover his mouth. "The pattern you observe," Wald continued, "is not a map of vulnerability. It is a map of where an aircraft can afford to be hit. The wings can take damage, the tail can take damage, but the engines cannot. The cockpit cannot, the fuel tanks cannot. Those are the places you never see bullet holes, because airplanes hit in those places do not return for us to study." The colonel sat down heavily in his chair. "So the armor should go on the engines," Wald said, "on the cockpit, on the fuel systems, the places that show no damage. Because those are the places that, when hit, are fatal." The room erupted. Questions, objections, excitement. The director of the Statistical Research Group, a man named Alan Wallace, raised his hand for quiet. "Wald," he said, "can you prove this mathematically?" "Yes," Wald said. "Give me 3 days." What happened in those 3 days would save thousands of lives. But to understand why Wald saw what others missed, one must understand the man himself, and to understand the man, one must go back to a farmhouse in Transylvania, where a boy learned that the world was not always what it appeared to be. Abraham Wald was born on October 31st, 1902, in Cluj, a city in what was then the Kingdom of Hungary. His grandfather was a rabbi, his father a baker. The Wald family was Orthodox Jewish, observant, devout, and they did not work on the Sabbath. They did not send their children to school on Saturdays, as Hungarian law required. So Abraham was educated at home. His parents taught him. His older brother taught him. By the time other boys his age were learning multiplication tables in classrooms, Abraham was studying calculus at the kitchen table. Numbers made sense to him in a way that words sometimes did not. Mathematics was pure, logical. It could not lie. When he finally entered formal schooling, he was years ahead of his peers. He finished secondary education at 16, entered university at 18, earned his doctorate in mathematics from the University of Vienna at 29. His dissertation explored a problem in geometry so abstract that perhaps a dozen people in the world could fully understand it. But this was 1931. Europe was changing. Economic collapse, political extremism. In Vienna, Wald found himself trapped. He was brilliant. Everyone acknowledged this. His professors recommended him for academic positions, but he was Jewish, and Austria, even before the Nazi annexation, did not want Jewish professors. For 7 years, Wald survived on temporary positions and the generosity of colleagues. He worked for an economist named Oscar Morgenstern, who created a research position for him when no university would hire him. Wald published papers, made contributions to statistical theory that would later be considered foundational, lived in uncertainty, month to month, never knowing if the next paycheck would come. Then, in March 1938, Germany annexed Austria, the Anschluss. Overnight, Vienna became part of the Reich. Jews were dismissed from their positions, synagogues burned, people disappeared. Wald watched his colleagues flee, those who could afford passage, those who had connections abroad. He had neither. What he had was his reputation. Mathematicians in America knew his work. They respected it. And when the Cowles Commission for Research in Economics offered him a fellowship to work in the United States, Wald did not hesitate. He left Vienna in September 1938 with one suitcase and his wife, Lucille. Behind him, the country where he'd spent his adult life descended into horror. He arrived in New York speaking limited English. He knew perhaps 3 people in the entire country, but he had mathematics. Mathematics did not require fluency. Equations spoke the same language everywhere. Columbia University hired him to work with a renowned statistician named Harold Hotelling. Wald's task was simple: learn American statistical methods, contribute where he could, publish, teach, build a life in exile. Then came Pearl Harbor. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked the American fleet in Hawaii. 4 days later, Germany declared war on the United States. Suddenly, the nation that had offered Wald refuge was at war with the nation that had driven him away. The irony was not lost on him. Universities across America mobilized for the war effort. Physicists worked on radar and the atomic bomb. Chemists developed new explosives. Engineers designed weapons. And statisticians, those peculiar mathematicians who dealt in probabilities and data, found themselves in sudden demand. The military had problems, so many problems: how to inspect munitions quickly without testing every single round, how to predict where U-boats would surface, how to determine the optimal search patterns for anti-submarine patrols, how to use limited resources most effectively. Traditional military thinking could not answer these questions. What was needed was a different kind of mind. Minds trained to see patterns in chaos, to extract signal from noise, to think in terms of probabilities rather than certainties. In July 1942, the Office of Scientific Research and Development created the Statistical Research Group at Columbia University. They recruited 18 researchers. Abraham Wald was among them. The SRG operated out of a building at 401 West 118th Street in Morningside Heights, just a block from the main Columbia campus. They worked in teams, tackled problems sent from Washington, from the Navy, from the Army Air Forces. Each problem was stamped with security classifications. Each solution could save lives. Wald's colleagues were extraordinary. Milton Friedman, who would later win a Nobel Prize in economics. Leonard Savage, whose work on decision theory would reshape statistics. Frederick Mostella, who would revolutionize survey methodology. George Stigler, another future Nobel laureate. These were not ordinary academics. They were the best mathematical minds in America, assembled in one building, given unlimited coffee and impossible problems. The work was classified. Wald could not discuss it with anyone outside the group. Security was so strict that his secretaries sometimes had to remove papers from his hands before he finished reading them, because his status as a recent immigrant meant he lacked the highest clearances. The joke around the office was that Wald wasn't allowed to read his own work, but the work itself was thrilling. It was mathematics applied to life and death. Every equation represented real human beings in real danger. Get the answer right, and sailors came home. Pilots survived. Get it wrong, and people died. The problems varied wildly. One week, they analyzed the reliability of naval gun mounts. The next, they worked on quality. Control procedures for artillery shells. They calculated optimal search patterns for aircraft hunting submarines. They estimated how many torpedoes a destroyer should carry. And then, in early March 1943, a colonel from the Army Air Forces arrived with photographs of damaged bombers, and Abraham Wald saw what everyone else had missed. The concept seems obvious in retrospect: survivorship bias, the tendency to focus on things that survived a process while ignoring those that did not. It's why we think old buildings are better made than modern ones. We see the sturdy structures from 2 centuries ago still standing. We don't see the thousands of poorly built structures from that same era, which collapsed decades ago and were carted away as rubble. It's why people believe musicians were better in the past. We remember the great artists from the 1960s. We've forgotten the hundreds of mediocre bands from that decade who never made it past local bars. History is written by survivors. The dead leave no records. In March 1943, the Army Air Forces was suffering devastating losses. Bomber crews had a life expectancy measured in missions, not years. A standard tour of duty required 25 combat missions. Statistically, most crews didn't make it past 15. The odds of completing a full tour were worse than 1 in 3. The losses fell into patterns Some aircraft were shot down by fighters, others hit by flak, the German anti-aircraft artillery. Still others developed mechanical problems and ditched in the ocean. But the sheer volume of losses, sometimes over 10% per mission, meant something had to change. The Air Force, brass, wanted more armor. Logical. Armor stops bullets, but armor weighs. A B-17 Flying Fortress, fully loaded with bombs and fuel, weighed 32 tons. Every pound of armor added meant less bomb payload, shorter range, or reduced altitude. Engineers calculated that adding 1,000 pounds of armor plate to a bomber would reduce its operational ceiling by 1,000 feet. That might seem trivial, but 1,000 feet was the difference between being above the effective range of German flak or flying directly through it. So the question became, where do you put the armor? Where is it most needed? The Air Force's answer seemed straightforward. Study the bombers that come back, map where they're damaged, reinforce those areas. It's what any rational person would do. If 90% of returning aircraft have bullet holes in their wings, clearly wings need armor. If 80% show damage to the tail section, the tail needs reinforcement. The data appeared incontrovertible. Except Abraham Wald looked at that data and asked a different question. Not, where are the returning planes damaged, but why are these particular planes the ones that returned? The logical leap required seeing the invisible. The aircraft in the photographs were not a random sample of all aircraft. They were a highly selected sample, a biased sample. They represented only the aircraft tough enough or lucky enough or damaged in just the right places to limp home. The aircraft that didn't return, the ones shot down over Germany, the ones that went into the North Sea with all hands lost. Those aircraft were also part of the story. In fact, they were the most important part of the story. Their damage patterns would show where aircraft could not afford to be hit, but those aircraft were gone, destroyed, inaccessible. The military had no way to examine them, no way to know where they'd been hit. Or did they? Wald realized that the absence of evidence was itself evidence. The clean areas on returning bombers, the sections showing little to no damage, those were not areas the Germans weren't shooting at. They were areas where hits were fatal. Bombers struck in those locations didn't make it back to have their damage catalogued. It was a problem of inverse probability. Given that an aircraft survived, what could you infer about the aircraft that didn't? It was the kind of problem Wald had been trained to solve, the kind of abstract mathematical reasoning that seemed useless in peacetime but became invaluable in war. He went to work. For 3 days, Wald barely left the statistical research group offices. He worked through meals, slept on a cot in the back room, covered blackboards with equations. His colleagues brought him coffee and left him alone. They knew better than to interrupt when Wald was deep in a problem. What Wald needed to calculate was the probability distribution of hits across an entire aircraft, not just the aircraft that survived. He started with an assumption. A bomber flying through German airspace would be exposed to a roughly uniform distribution of fire. Bullets and flak didn't aim for specific parts of the aircraft. They were scattered by wind, distance, the chaos of combat. Therefore, if you flew 1,000 bombers through German airspace, you'd expect roughly equal damage across all parts of each aircraft. Wings, fuselage, tail, engines, cockpit, all should show similar levels of hits. But that's not what the returning aircraft showed. They showed concentrated damage in certain areas and almost no damage in others. The only explanation was differential survival. Bombers hit in the wings survived. Bombers hit in the engines did not. Wald formalized this into mathematics. He calculated the expected number of hits per square foot of aircraft surface area, assuming uniform exposure to fire. Then he compared this to the observed distribution on returning aircraft. The difference between expected and observed hits gave him an estimate of lethality. Areas with more hits than expected were non-lethal. Areas with fewer hits than expected were lethal. The formula was elegant. The implications were profound. When Wald presented his findings to the military liaison, he didn't just offer an opinion, he provided mathematical proof. A memorandum titled "A Method of Estimating Plane Vulnerability Based on Damage of Survivors." The title was dry. The contents were revolutionary. Wald's analysis showed that the engine compartment, despite showing minimal damage on returning aircraft, was by far the most vulnerable area of a B-17. A hit to the engine had roughly a 70% chance of bringing down the aircraft. In contrast, a hit to the wing had less than a 15% chance of catastrophic failure. The fuel tanks similarly showed little damage on returning bombers, but Wald's calculations indicated that fuel tank hits were nearly always fatal. The cockpit, the same. These were the kill zones. These were where armor belonged. The military accepted his recommendations. Within weeks, B-17s rolling off assembly lines in Seattle featured additional armor plating around engines, around cockpits, around fuel systems. The weight penalty was significant, but the survival rate began to climb. Exact statistics are hard to come by, classified at the time, scattered across archives now. But historians estimate that Wald's insight, combined with other armor improvements and the introduction of long-range fighter escorts, helped reduce bomber loss rates from over 10% per mission in late 1943 to under 5% by mid-1944. 5% still sounds high. It was high. It meant 1 in 20 aircraft lost on every mission. But compared to 10%, it meant half as many crews killed, half as many telegrams sent to families, half as many young men who would never come home. If you believe a single piece of metal can change the course of a war, type the number 7 in the comments. By the winter of 1944, the air war over Europe had transformed into a grinding campaign of attrition. Every morning, before dawn, airfields across England came alive with the sound of engines. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators taxied into position. Crews performed pre-flight checks in the freezing darkness. Bombardiers tested their Norden bomb sites. Gunners loaded belts of 50 caliber ammunition into their turrets. The missions followed a brutal pattern. Take off in formation, climb to 25,000 feet, cross the Channel into occupied Europe, navigate through walls of German anti-aircraft fire, drop bombs on industrial targets deep in the Reich, fight off waves of Luftwaffe interceptors, limp home with damaged engines and wounded crewmen, land, count the missing aircraft, do it again the next day. The young men who flew these missions understood the mathematics of their survival. A tour of duty required 25 missions, but the loss rates meant that statistically, most crews would be shot down before completing even half that number. Some bomber groups lost over half their aircraft in a single month. The 100th Bomb Group, stationed at Thorpe Abbotts, became known as the Bloody 100th because of their casualties. The mess halls and Nissen huts, pilots and crew members developed their own rituals, lucky jackets, good luck charms, photographs of girlfriends tucked into flight suits. These talismans meant nothing against 88mm flak shells, but they gave men something to believe in when belief was all they had. The B-17 itself had become legendary. Newspapers called it the Flying Fortress. Propaganda films showed them shrugging off fighter attacks, bristling with machine guns, invincible. The reality was more complicated. Yes, the B-17 could absorb tremendous damage. There were stories of bombers returning with entire tail sections shot away, with engines missing, with holes large enough to walk through. These aircraft became proof of the bomber's toughness. But for every bomber that made it home damaged, there were others that simply disappeared. A flash of flame, a spiral into the clouds. No parachutes, no survivors. The crews knew this. They lived with it every mission. 20-year-old men aging into something harder, something hollowed out by fear and repeated exposure to death. They watched their friends' aircraft go down, watched the smoke trails, counted the chutes, and then they climbed into their own aircraft and flew the next mission. This was the context in which Abraham Wald's work began to save lives. The armor modifications started appearing on new production aircraft in late 1943. Engineers at Boeing's Seattle plant added steel plating around the engine mounts. The plates were angled to deflect shrapnel from below, where flak bursts were most likely to send fragments upward. Additional armor wrapped around the oil coolers, protecting the systems that kept engines from overheating. The cockpit received reinforced bulkheads, not enough to stop a direct hit from a 20mm cannon shell. Nothing could stop that, but enough to deflect smaller caliber rounds and flak fragments. Armor was added beneath the pilot's seats, around the fuel tanks, anywhere Wald's calculations had identified as lethal. The weight penalty was real. Each B-17G now carried approximately 500 pounds more armor than earlier models. That meant slightly reduced range, slightly lower operational ceiling. But it also meant crews came home. The change was not instantaneous. Aircraft already in service couldn't be easily retrofitted. The modifications only applied to new production. It took months for the improved bombers to reach England in significant numbers. And during those months, the old losses continued. But by early 1944, maintenance officers began noticing a pattern. The newer aircraft, the ones with the engine armor, were surviving hits that would have downed earlier models. A B-17G took flak over Brunswick, shrapnel tearing into the No. 3 engine. The armor deflected the fragments. The engine kept running. The bomber made it home. Another aircraft over Frankfurt, a Focke-Wulf 190, made a head-on attack. 20mm cannons blazing. Shells struck the cockpit area. The reinforced bulkhead held. The co-pilot was hit in the shoulder, but survived. Without the armor, both pilots would have died, and the aircraft would have gone down with all hands. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a broader statistical shift that became visible only when examining hundreds of missions. Loss rates for armored aircraft ran consistently lower than for unarmored aircraft flying the same missions. The difference was measured in percentage points, 2% here, 3% there, but those percentage points represented human lives. No one sent Abraham Wald a thank you letter. No general held a press conference to announce that a mathematician's insight had saved hundreds of airmen. Wald's work remained classified. The memoranda he wrote stayed locked in safes. Even after the war, when some documents were declassified, his contribution remained obscure, known only to specialists. Wald himself never sought recognition. He was not that kind of man. He worked, he solved problems, he moved on to the next problem. And there were always more problems. The Statistical Research Group tackled one military challenge after another. They worked on sequential analysis, a method for testing munitions that required far fewer rounds to be fired, saving time and resources. They developed sampling inspection procedures that revolutionized quality control in ammunition factories. They calculated optimal strategies for naval gunfire. Each problem was a puzzle. Each solution saved resources, improved efficiency, or kept people alive. The work was abstract, mathematical, but the consequences were concrete. Wald's colleagues remembered him as quiet, intense, meticulous. He would work for hours without speaking, scribbling equations on paper, erasing, starting again. And when he had an answer, he presented it without fanfare. Here is the problem. Here is the solution. Here is the proof. Milton Friedman, who worked alongside Wald in the SRG, later said that Wald possessed the rarest quality a statistician could have, the ability to see what wasn't there. Most people looked at data and saw what it showed. Wald looked at data and saw what it concealed. The missing information, the unstated assumptions, the invisible biases. This ability came, perhaps, from Wald's history. A man who had fled one country for another, who had watched his world collapse and rebuilt his life from nothing, who understood that the obvious narrative was not always the true narrative, who knew that what you couldn't see might matter more than what you could. The survivorship bias insight became a cornerstone of operational research, the new field that emerged from wartime statistical work. After the war, the concept spread to other domains. Economists used it to study business failures. Medical researchers used it to avoid bias in clinical trials. Engineers used it in safety analysis. But in March 1943, it was simply a way to keep bombers in the air and bring crews home. The numbers tell part of the story. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 176 bombers in a single month. By October 1944, with better armor, better tactics, and long-range fighter escorts, monthly losses had dropped to under 100 aircraft, despite flying more missions against harder targets. The human cost remained staggering. The 8th Air Force alone suffered over 47,000 casualties during the war, killed in action, missing in action, prisoners of war. For every crew that completed their 25 missions and went home, there were crews that didn't make it past their 5th mission, but thousands of men who would have died in unarmored aircraft survived because Abraham Wald understood survivorship bias. They came home, they married, raised families, lived ordinary lives, never knowing that a Hungarian mathematician working in a Columbia University office had calculated the probability of their survival and changed where the armor went. This is the invisible legacy of statistical thinking, lives saved by people who never meet, disasters prevented by equations that most people will never see, the quiet application of reason to chaos. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. Germany's industrial capacity had been destroyed. The Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. Allied armies advanced from the west and east. On April 25, 1945, the 8th Air Force flew its final bombing mission. The Statistical Research Group disbanded shortly after the war ended. The 18 members scattered, back to their universities, back to their research. They had worked together for 3 years, solving impossible problems under impossible deadlines. And now, it was over. Abraham Wald returned to teaching at Columbia. He published papers on sequential analysis, on statistical decision theory, on geometry. His work was brilliant, foundational, but it reached a small audience, other statisticians, mathematicians, graduate students. He never spoke publicly about his wartime work. It remained classified. Even when he gave lectures on statistical methods, he used hypothetical examples rather than real ones. The bomber problem became a manufacturer analyzing defects in products that failed before reaching inspection. The mathematics was the same. The context was sanitized. In 1950, Wald was invited to India to give a series of lectures at universities and statistical institutes. The Indian government wanted to modernize its statistical infrastructure. Wald, by then recognized as one of the world's leading statisticians, was asked to share his expertise. He and his wife Lucille traveled to Calcutta, then to Bangalore, then to smaller cities. The lectures were well attended. Students asked questions. Wald patiently explained. Concepts, drew diagrams on blackboards, made complex ideas accessible. On December 13, 1950, Abraham and Lucille Wald boarded an Air India flight from Bangalore to Bombay. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, a civilian version of the military transport. Reliable, widely used. The weather was clear. The plane never arrived in Bombay. It crashed into the Nilgiri Mountains in southern India. All aboard were killed. Abraham Wald was 48 years old. The news reached Columbia by telegram. His colleagues were devastated. The Statistical Research Group members, scattered across the country, wrote letters of condolence. They shared memories. The quiet man who could see patterns invisible to others. The refugee who had contributed so much to his adopted country. The mathematician who had saved thousands of lives with a single insight. But most of those saved lives never knew his name. The bomber crews who survived because their engines had armor. The pilots who walked away from crashes that should have killed them. They went on with their lives, unaware of the man whose calculations had given them a chance. That is often how the world works. The heroes are invisible. The crucial decisions are made in offices far from the action. The difference between life and death comes down to someone asking the right question at the right time. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The legacy of Abraham Wald's work extends far beyond the bombers of World War II. Survivorship bias has become a fundamental concept in statistics, economics, medicine, and engineering. It's taught in universities, referenced in research papers, used to design better experiments and avoid flawed conclusions. In finance, analysts learned to account for survivorship bias when studying mutual fund performance. They realized that only looking at funds that still existed would overestimate returns because failed funds were excluded from the data. This insight came directly from Wald's bomber work. In medicine, clinical trials began incorporating methods to track all patients, not just those who completed treatment. Patients who dropped out of studies often did so because of side effects or treatment failure. Ignoring them biased the results. Wald's framework provided a way to account for this. In aviation safety, engineers investigating crashes adopted Wald's inverse reasoning. They studied not just the aircraft that survived incidents, but tried to infer what happened to those that didn't. This led to improvements in everything from engine design to evacuation procedures. The concept even reached popular culture. Business books warned about survivorship bias when learning from successful companies. Self-help authors cautioned against only studying winners while ignoring the far larger number of people who tried the same strategies and failed. But the original application, the one that saved lives in 1944, remains the most dramatic example because it was life and death, because the stakes were measured in burning aircraft and missing crews, because a mathematician who had fled the Nazis helped defeat them with nothing but a blackboard and the ability to see what everyone else missed. The photographs that started it all, the grainy images of damaged bombers that the colonel brought to Columbia University in March 1943, those photographs were destroyed after the war. Classified material was routinely incinerated. The specific aircraft depicted in those images are unknown. The crews who flew them are unnamed in the historical record. What survives is Wald's memorandum. It was declassified in 1980 and published by the Center for Naval Analyses. The mathematics is dense, pages of equations, probability distributions, statistical proofs, but buried in those equations is a simple, profound truth. What you don't see is often more important than what you do see. The bombers that made it home were not representative of all bombers. They were the lucky ones, the survivors. To understand the whole picture, you had to think about the aircraft that weren't there, the ones that went down over Germany, the ones at the bottom of the North Sea, the invisible data points. In a sense, Abraham Wald's entire life had prepared him for that insight. He knew about invisibility, about being erased from official narratives. As a Jew in Vienna, he had watched people disappear from university positions, from public life, from existence itself. He understood that absence carried information. When he looked at those photographs of damaged aircraft, he saw absence, holes in the data, and he understood what those holes meant. The military brass who came to the statistical research group that day were looking for a simple answer. Tell us where to put the armor. They expected the mathematicians to confirm what seemed obvious, but Wald gave them the opposite answer, and he proved he was right. That willingness to question the obvious, to challenge assumptions, to ask, what are we not seeing, is perhaps Wald's greatest legacy. Not just the armor placement, not just the lives saved, but the example of thinking clearly in the face of incomplete information. War is chaos. Data is always incomplete. The dead cannot speak. But if you think carefully enough, if you use the right mathematical tools, you can hear what they might have said. You can infer the shape of what's missing. That is what Abraham Wald did. And in doing so, he changed the outcome of the air war, one armored engine at a time. The men who flew in those reinforced bombers never knew his name. But they lived. They came home. They had children and grandchildren. And somewhere in those extended family trees are lives that exist because a mathematician asked the right question at precisely the right moment. That is how wars are won. Not just with bombs and bullets, but with thought, with the careful application of reason to problems that seem impossible, with people who can see what isn't there. Abraham Wald died in a plane crash 8 years before the Strategic Air Command would adopt his sequential analysis methods for testing nuclear weapons. He never saw how thoroughly his ideas would reshape military planning. He never knew that future generations of statisticians would learn his name in textbooks, study his proofs, build on his foundations. He was simply a man who fled persecution, found refuge, and used his mind to repay the country that took him in. He asked questions. He calculated probabilities. He wrote memoranda that few people read, but many people benefited from. In the archives of the Center for Naval Analyses, there is a folder containing Abraham Wald's wartime work. 8 technical memoranda, hundreds of pages. Most of it is mathematical notation that would be incomprehensible to a general reader. But memorandum number 1, dated 1943, bears the title, A Method of Estimating Plane Vulnerability Based on Damage of Survivors. That memorandum is a monument, not to generals or politicians or pilots, but to a way of thinking, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought with pencil and paper, that sometimes the clearest vision comes from someone who learned to see differently because the world forced them to, and somewhere in an unmarked grave in the Nilgiri mountains of India lies a man who looked at photographs of bullet holes and saw the holes that weren't there, who understood that the planes that didn't come back had the most important story to tell, who saved thousands of lives by thinking carefully about absence. If you believe that the greatest acts of heroism sometimes happen in quiet offices where brilliant minds grapple with impossible problems and emerge with answers that change the world, then Abraham Wald's story deserves to be remembered, not because he sought fame, but because he represents something essential about how human beings survive impossible odds, not through force, not through luck, but through the patient application of reason, through the willingness to question assumptions, through the courage to say, I think everyone is looking at this wrong. The bombers kept flying, the armor kept working, the war moved toward its conclusion, and in Columbia University offices, mathematicians moved on to new problems. But for those few months, in 1943, a man who had escaped the Nazis sat in a room full of photographs and saw what no one else could see. He saw the invisible bombers, the ones that never came home, and he honored them by making sure fewer would follow. That is the story of Abraham Wald and the missing bullet holes, a story about statistics and survival, about bias and perception, about the difference between what we see and what is actually true. And it is a story about how sometimes, in the midst of the world's greatest catastrophe, a single question asked by the right person at the right time can save thousands of lives. What assumptions are you making? And are they justified? Abraham Wald asked those questions every day. The world is better because he did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.